All right, so let's get started. So welcome everyone. Really pleased that you could take some time out of your day to join us for this session. This is the second in our series to introduce you to a bit more detail about bidirectional contract testing. So we've just got a poll there on the screen. If you can just complete that for us, just as I'm doing the introduction, just to let us know a little bit more about you. Today we're going to be talking about bidirectional contract testing. We're using OpenAPI documentation. And I've got my colleague Matt here, Matt Fellows. He's a familiar face. If you haven't met him or seen him around the traps, I would be surprised. Matt, should we just roll over into the intro screens? Thank you. Awesome. So as I said, Matt Fellows here, and I didn't introduce myself. I'm Alicia Foreman, and I work as the product marketing manager with the Pactflow team. Cool. So I guess in terms of agenda for today, we are going to firstly take you through just a detailed introduction to bidirectional contract testing. Matt is then going to run through a demo for you. We'll have a bit of a recap and a summary, and then finally we'll have time for Q&A. Please use the Q&A function that we've got here in Zoom, and we will just table those questions at the end. I'll be available in the chat while Matt is talking, but yeah, looking forward to this today. And Matt, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Alicia. Thanks everybody for coming along. Happy Friday for those of you who it's Friday here in the future. So I'm going to do a bit of an intro to bidirectional contract testing. We're then going to do a little bit of a demo, and obviously we'd love to answer any questions you've got. So I guess bidirectional contract testing, what is it? Let's start with that. Excuse me while I'm organizing my views. So it's a new form of contract testing that is basically here to complement our existing support for consumer-driven contract testing with Pact. Bidirectional is a little bit different in the sense that it's a type of static contract testing where two contracts basically get compared to make sure they're compatible. One of those contracts is the consumer contract, so very similar to Pact, and it contains the expectations of a given consumer against a given provider. And the other contract is actually the provider's contract. So, for example, an OpenAPI specification that describes the full capabilities of that provider. And basically what we'll do is teams can generate that consumer contract. They can keep using Pact, or you can keep using Pact to generate that contract, or you can use tools you're already using now to generate that contract. And we've got some adapters that you can use. And in the case of an adapter, in case you've got a tool that we don't have an adapter for, you can build your own kind of adapter to generate a contract from a mock. So for example, today we'll be talking about Cypress and how you can generate a Pact spec from Cypress. On the flip side, on the provider side, your job is to make sure you bring your own provider testing tool. So again, you might use tools like Wiremock or Rest Assured, but today we're going to use Postman to test our provider and make sure it's compatible with the spec. And Pactflow is going to make sure those two things they don't drift. So basically, you can upgrade your existing tools into a contract testing workflow. I guess just to compare this to Pact, if you're used to it, Pact is a little bit different in that it's more of a record and replay style contract test. The consumer side will run a series of tests against the behavior of that consumer. And at the end of it, it spits out a contract that has the expectations of this consumer against its particular provider. And then what happens though is we replay that same contract against a provider, a running provider locally, to make sure that it can handle all those requests. And so that's probably the main difference in terms of approaches. So there's a few different outcomes that you can expect from this type of contract testing versus, let's say, traditionally with Pact. So the first thing is there's a lower barrier to entry. So Pact is a really powerful tool, but it is a bit different. And sometimes teams can struggle to get the value of Pact quickly, or take a bit of time to learn how it works. And because it's a white box testing tool, that can create some challenges as well. So this particular approach means you can use your existing tools, and it also means that there's a lower requirement on upskilling your teams and having to transform your ways of working to use it. So similarly, because you can reuse existing tests you've already built. So Cypress or Postman, it means you can rapidly increase coverage and scale your contract testing across teams. Excuse me. And the third one is like expanded roles. So as I said before, Pact is a white box testing tool. So it really wants to run in a unit test context, which means you need to have access to code to do this. And that can be a barrier to entry for certain types of roles in your team or engineers in your team, such as QAs and testers who may not be part of your team or may not have access to the code. And lastly, because you can reuse your existing processes, your existing tools, and because it doesn't take you as long to get to coverage with contract testing, that's going to improve your ROI for the cost of implementing your contract testing initiative. Cool. So this is all great theory. Kind of how does it work? So we'll start with a bit of a schema view, and then we'll dive into more of a step-by-step, and then of course, then we'll get to the demo. So the first thing to note with bidirectional contract testing is that you can actually initiate the contract testing from either side. So with Pact, it's very much consumer-driven. It has to come from the consumer side first, but with bidirectional, it could come from either. So the common use case we would see with bidirectional is starting from the provider first. So we'll start with our OpenAPI spec, whether that's written by hand or generated from code. We're then going to bring our own provider testing tool, such as Postman, to make sure that our local provider is compatible with the OpenAPI spec. So we call that verifying a provider contract. On the consumer side, very similar to Pact, you're going to bring your consumer code base. You're going to write a series of tests against that consumer that rely on its provider as a mock. And at the end of that testing session, it's going to produce a consumer contract. Now, there's some choices here. If you're using Pact, it'll just work as usual. If you're not using Pact, you can use tools like Cypress, or you bring your own tool, but your job is to make sure you serialize the mocks into a contract file. Now, once you've got those two artifacts, obviously both of those will go up to Pactflow in their own pipeline, publish those up. And what Pactflow will do is confirm that the consumer contract is a valid subset of the provider contract. So if the consumer adds something new that the provider can't do, it'll fail the build. And if the provider removes something or changes something so that it's not compatible with its consumers, its build will fail. Okay, so let's dive into a bit more detail here. Before that diagram kind of showed it as if you were doing both at the same time, but really, just like contract testing with Pact, you're going to run your consumer pipeline completely separate from your provider pipeline. So on the consumer side, step one, the consumer test, we're going to test the consumer's behavior against a mock. So in today's example, we're going to use side.intercept, but you can imagine this to be all kinds of ways of doing mocks. The consumer contract gets published to Pactflow. Sorry, it gets produced in terms of a Pact file. So it's worth mentioning here that it needs to be saved as a Pact file. That's just the artifact. You don't need to use Pact, right? So it's just a Pact format where you're using as an interchange to capture those expectations. Step 3 is to then publish that to Pactflow. We then can call can I deploy when it's ready to deploy the software somewhere. And that's when we do the compatibility check with the provider. So you can use this as a standard gate to deployments, or you can use it as a can I merge check, which is a common thing as well. And then once we've found it safe to release, we would deploy that consumer and we record that deployment with Pactflow to say that this particular version of software has been deployed to a particular environment. Very similarly on the provider side, you start with the OpenAPI spec or your provider contract. And as I said, that can be generated by hand or by code. We then test that contract against the provider. So again, you've got to make sure that the provider contract is sound and is compatible with your actual code. The provider contract then gets uploaded to Pactflow. We then call can I deploy to see if it's safe to release, just like with the consumer. And similarly, once it is safe to release and we want to release it, we deploy the provider, we record that deployment with Pactflow. Okay. So that is the general process. Let's get to a bit of a demo. So today, our use case is going to be a provider-first workflow. We've got a product catalog API. It's got 3 endpoints, one to create a product, one to get all products, and one to find a product by its ID. The provider API is going to be written in Node.js. We're going to use Postman to test that. So we've actually got an existing Postman collection, and potentially we've been doing manual testing, and now we're sort of evolving that to use Newman, which is the CLI counterpart of Postman, which means we can run that Postman collection as a series of tests, locally through scripting and also through CI. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to take our Postman collection and turn it into an OpenAPI spec. And then that's the spec that gets published and used around. So in this case here, we're actually ensuring that what we publish as an OpenAPI spec is actually what's in the Postman collection. So this is an interesting idea, and we can get into the nuance of that later. But one challenge sometimes with testing OpenAPI is that most tools will tell you you're compatible with the spec, but they won't tell you that you've actually implemented its spec. So for example, it's possible to hit 2 of these endpoints out of 3, and most tools won't say you've missed that 3rd endpoint. So by converting our Postman collection into an OpenAPI spec, we're not going to miss any of those other endpoints, because only the endpoints we've tested actually get converted to the OpenAPI spec. And therefore, they're the only endpoints that we're saying we're actually supporting. So that's the provider side. On the consumer side, we're going to have a React app, again, a Node/JavaScript app. And we're going to test that using Cypress. And we're going to use the Cypress mocking capabilities to keep that simple. So in this workflow, there's no Pact. There really is no Pact here at all. We're not using the Pact library. We're using 2 separate tools that the teams are comfortable with. Of course, we're going to use can I deploy to gate release, and we're going to break things. We'll show you how to break things. Okay, so we'll come back to this diagram in just a second. Let's go look at the code bases, and we'll see what it would look like to plug that into a pipeline. So we'll go to our provider code base first, just so you can get a bit of a sense for it. Over here, you can see we've got our provider routes. So we support /product, get a single product, get all products, and create a product. We don't need to go into too much detail here, but you can imagine we've got a product domain model here. We've got our controllers that respond to that pull from the repository, and so on and so on. That's our provider code base. Over here on the consumer side, we have a React application here. So you can see there's the page here to list all the products. We've got a product page. So a product page here. There we go. That's going to pull in the product when the page loads. And it's going to use this API class to do that. So we have an API class over here, which gets all products, get a single product. Don't need to go into too much detail here, but you can see that there's a couple of endpoints that get called. We don't actually create a product from this app. So we're just using 2 endpoints. But more importantly, over here on the consumer side, we have 3 Cypress tests. So one test over here, you can see goes to the product page. It uses sci.intercept for any calls to product on this page, and returns back an HTTP 200 with a product response. So over here in our fixtures folder, we have a single product, and we have a list of products. And you can see we've got Cypress specs for all of those. And actually what we're doing here is we're using this Cypress adapter that Pactflow's created, that will basically just register that we care about this endpoint, and we're going to wait for that interaction to happen. So over here in the Cypress plugins index, you can see we're actually registering the Cypress Pact adapter, and we're just exporting that method so it's available to the Cypress runtime. Back over in our provider code base, we're using Postman to do the testing of the provider. You can see over here, we're using Newman to run our tests. You can see it's running against, it's reading this Postman environment and Postman collection in here. Okay, if I just jump into that directory for one moment, you can see here's the environment variables to run Postman, and here's the actual Postman collection with tests in it. So you can see we've got one to get products, we've got one to get a single product, we've got one to create a product, and so on. But inside there, we also have, we're using the JavaScript capabilities of of Postman and Newman, which will also add some extra assertions on those responses to give us increased confidence that they're working as expected. And we're going to use Newman to run these tests. And at the end of it, we're using a little tool called Postman to API. And that's going to convert our Postman's collection into an OpenAPI spec. And so then when we upload this OpenAPI spec to Pactflow, we're feeling much more confident about that OpenAPI spec because we know only the things that are in that Postman collection, which is what we're testing, actually get put into the OpenAPI, which then goes into Pactflow. So we have confidence that that's actually a valid thing. All right. So the last thing we're going to do is the first thing we're going to do is we're going to run what it would look like to build our provider, push it into GitHub in this case, and we're going to run a pipeline through GitHub Actions. So first step is we're going to run our Postman collection against our locally running provider to make sure we're comfortable with the spec. In this case, we're going to produce the OpenAPI spec as well as validate it. We're then going to publish that to Pactflow along with the test results. We're then going to say, can we deploy this piece of software to production? And the answer should be yes the first time around because there are no consumers yet. We're not going to break anybody. So our pipeline is going to look like that. Now, it just so happens we've got a pipeline we've created earlier. You can see over here in our pipeline, we've got some green builds, but I'll go into the last standard build. You can see it's been a bit bigger. We've got a test, can I deploy, then deploy phase. If we actually go into the test phase for a second, I'll scroll down here. You can see it's running the Postman test. They're the different endpoints it's doing. So you can see it's calling get products, make it a bit bigger. And you can see it's calling localhost 3001. So it's running it all locally, checking the status code, checking the body, all good. So we've got 3 passing tests. Scroll right down, that's all passed. What we do then is we actually upload the contract, the provider contract to Pactflow, which is what's going on here. Sort of debug mode, so there's a lot of noise. You come down to the end of it, it should be all, a base 64. So now that's it. We've done a test, we've published our Pact. After that, you can see we run the can I deploy step. Is it safe to release this piece of software? You can see the answer is yes. In this case, it actually is integrated to other examples and it's all passed. But of course, if it's a brand new consumer with a provider with no consumers, it would have nothing in that table. And then we mark that and we deploy that piece of software to production. Okay. So that was that workflow there. So now we actually would have a contract in Pactflow and an integration in Pactflow. So let's have a quick look for that one. Is it this one? I don't know why it's not showing up there, but might need to refresh. Oh, hang on, it's an old contract, of course. I haven't run the build. So let's have a quick look. It might be there from before. No, all good. We'll come back to that in just a moment. So now that the provider pipeline is run as a contract in Pactflow, we can rerun these tests over here as well. What I'm going to do in the background is just kick that provider job off again, just so we've got run all of that. So that'll take a minute or so to run through that phase, and that will push up to Pactflow, the latest contract. So give that a minute. What we're going to do now, of course, is we've now got a provider that's been built and is tested and is deployed to prod. We can now run the consumer test. We can run our Cypress test. We can build our consumer. We can write the test for it, and then we can run a similar pipeline. So the pipeline on the consumer side looks a little bit different, but still very similar. Step 1, we're going to run our contract tests. In this case, we're going to use Cypress, and it's going to produce a Pact file at the end of it. If that passes, of course, we're going to publish the contract to Pactflow along with the version information. And then we're going to say, can we deploy this to production? And because the provider is in production, hopefully by then, the answer should be yes, and we are compatible. And then therefore, we're going to deploy that to production as well. Okay. And it should be safe to release because the provider's OpenAPI spec is compatible with the consumer. All right, so the test phase has just happened for the Postman build. There you go, can I deploy, safe, good. And in any second now, it will deploy. So let me just go back over here. and I'll show you what that looks like in Pactflow. Okay, so it's actually published against a different consumer here because it's got a consumer now, but in a minute, it'll actually have a different consumer on top of that. But we can see for its other consumers that we've got a provider contract now for them. That's here. And you can see the endpoints that it supports. But more importantly, you can actually see, if I just zoom in here, you can see it's been deployed to prod just a minute ago. Okay, so our provider is now in production. And now when our consumer build runs, this should pass as well. So let me go down here and trigger the consumer build as well. This will take a little bit longer because it's a Cypress test, so they do take a little bit longer. But I'll show you a previous one earlier. Again, if I go to the test phase of this consumer build, you can see there's a test bit here, and then it publishes the packs. So if we dive into test, okay, you can see it starts the local React application on port 3000. It then kicks off the Cypress test. So you can see Cypress run headless, and now Cypress is kicking off its tests. Not sure why it's just running a single test there. Oh no, here we go. Yeah. So you can see it's running several tests, getting all the pages we saw before. I think blah, blah, blah. There we go. So 3 tests have passed. But more importantly, it's generated a contract as part of that. And then, of course, we're going to publish that contract. We're just going to use a standard Pact CLI to publish contracts here. So we're just going to use that Docker CLI thing to do that as well. And then that goes up to Pactflow. And as usual, you get the messages about the version and what you should do next. So let's go back here, and we'll give that a second to run. And so I should say that all of these examples, they're all available on our documentation page. So I'll just show you that while that build is running. Make it a bit bigger. So if you just head to Pactflow, docs.pactflow.io and head to the examples page, you'll see all of our examples here. And if you go down to the bottom, there's a section specifically for bidirectional contract testing. And you can see we've got a bunch of examples there. We're looking at the Cypress one and the Postman one. That's what we're doing today. And so here's all the examples and their compatibility here as well. We also have some workshops over here in the Pactflow University. If you go down to bidirectional contract testing, we have a kata coder, which you can do in the browser. And there's obviously a workshop here as well to take you through those steps. And then lastly, in our standard documentation, we have the detail. So if you head to contract testing, then bidirectional contract testing, you've kind of got all the detail here about the use cases, comparing to Pact, what contracts we support, how to publish things, and so on and so on. Okay, so coming back to the bidirectional consumer example with Cypress, you can see that's all run now. So let's just jump into Pactflow again very quickly, and we'll find the Cypress consumer now, which should have been deployed. There it is there. Okay, so you can see we now have a green integration between our Cypress consumer and our Postman provider. They've both been deployed to production. So great, happy days. We view the integration over here. We can see that the contract is compatible. So normally in this tab here, you would find any problems where we've compared those 2 contracts and we found some discrepancies. You can see the consumer contract, which just looks like the regular Pact one, as you can see down there. And you can get your provider contract as well. And lastly, in the provider contract, when you upload the provider contract, you can also see the test output. So this is actually the test output from the Newman logs. You can put whatever you want in here. This is more for you to help debug maybe why things aren't working, or to understand further what's going on. Okay, so now we've got our consumer and our provider in production. What happened in this can I deploy step though is interesting. This is where we do that cross-contract validation. When we've got 2 things we can compare, we actually do that. So if you go back to the first provider build, you'll note we don't do anything in can I deploy because there is no consumers. We check, is there any consumers here in production? No, so we're good to deploy. But once there is a consumer in production, or a provider in production in this case, we have to compare the contracts to make sure they're compatible. And so we call that cross-contract validation or contract comparison. And the results of that are what goes into that contract comparison tab. So just for clarity, you would see any errors here if that check failed. Okay, so just coming back to Postman to just close this out. Again, now that the consumer is in production, every time we run the Postman build now, it's going to run the exact same steps as before, except during can I deploy, it's going to run that cross-contract validation each time as well. So once we've got two things in production, or in any environment for that matter, Pactflow is going to make sure they stay compatible. We can't undo that now. Cool. So let's just quickly head back. What happens if you break something? What happens if you add a field to the consumer that is not compatible, or remove something from the provider that's not compatible? So let's kick off a build here to show you that scenario. So there's a pull request we've got, which I'll show you in a second, that's going to break things. I'm just going to run that branch build again and let it publish all the results to Pactflow so you can see. So that build is kicked off now. That's good. And I'll show you the pull request. So you can see here, we basically changed the route from /product/ID to /products/ID. Now you're like, why did you do that? So let's quickly look at the provider code base for a second. And you might see why. We're like, oh, why is this product and these things products? Like, we want to make that consistent, right? It's a bit ugly. So you can imagine someone going, yeah, actually, that's better. Let's fix it. So we've got this nice consistent REST API, and perhaps we should do that. But of course, we've got a consumer using it. So if we do that, it's going to break that consumer. It's very much a breaking change. So in this case here, the test is always going to pass because it's a unit test. So it's consistent with itself, and this is one of those really important things to note. And one of the reasons why I think this feature is so cool is because a lot of these tools are going to do exactly that. They're going to say, yeah, your code is totally compatible with itself. That's what testing does, unit tests do. But the important thing is, right, we changed our OpenAPI spec, we've changed our code base, they're now green, happy days. Well, no, actually it's not happy, because our consumer needed that endpoint and we've changed it. So if you go look at the can I deploy now, it's checking its compatibility against multiple consumers. You can see it's actually now breaking all those consumers. If we go into Pactflow, just give this a little refresh. There's this one. We can see the latest version of this contract is broken, hasn't been deployed. We've got a failed integration. If we dive into this, we'll see here that the request contains an unknown path or method. So basically, this get product 09, which the consumer needs, is not in the provider spec file. So if we come over here, we can actually see as well, specifically which consumer interaction is broken. So these two passed, but the single item failed, and you can see why. It's because in the provider spec, there is no path for that. Now, coming back over to the provider contract, it's actually green. You can see it was actually successful, and that just says to itself, the provider is consistent with the OpenAPI spec. But what we're saying is your provider is not consistent with what the consumers actually need, and that's the really important thing we're capturing here. So I won't do the demo I won't do that version for the consumer, but the exact same feedback will come in. It'll basically say, if you're adding something in there that the provider doesn't have, you're going to get a same kind of error here. It's going to say, no, that consumer can't do that because the provider doesn't have that capability. And lastly, what I will say as well, just like Pact, I'm just going to scroll down here for a second. If the provider removes a field that the consumer doesn't need, that's also not a breaking change. So hypothetically, if the provider had another field foo, well, the consumer is not using the property foo at the moment. We can check that. Go over here. You can see it doesn't care about foo. It's just using ID, type, name, version, and price. So removing foo from the product schema would not be a breaking change, and this process would let that through as well. So very similar to Pact in a sense, it's going to let you do it right down to the field level and give you that fidelity. Okay. So what did we learn? Hopefully we learned something. Okay, so why would I use this, and when would I use this? And why are we doing this if Pact is so good? and we love Pact, and we want to keep we're going to keep investing more in Pact. I maintain Pact. I want to keep doing that. So why do we do this in the first place? Well, there's a few reasons. There's some use cases that really aren't well suited to Pact, and there's also some context that we'd like to deal with. So for one, the main use case here, as we talked about, is a design first or an API first workflow. Particularly in large enterprises, APIs usually come first and the consumers come later. And the API could be written by hand. So the specification for that API could be written by hand, through architects and design sessions and things like this. And then the code comes afterwards. In those circumstances, Pact can work, but the process is a bit clunky because it really wants to be consumer driven, when in reality, the actual process is provider driven. The second thing is retrofitting contract tests onto existing systems, particularly when those systems have good tests already. So a really common objection we get is, why do I need to go and write all these Pact tests now that seemingly do what we've already got just so I can get a contract? And there's effort to do that, right? You need to write those Pact specs. You need to do it for all the different scenarios you've got, even if you've already tested those scenarios with tools. So bidirectional contract testing is the answer to that question. If you already have really good test coverage on both sides, but you're just lacking the contract test bit, this feature might be for you. Number 3 is about legacy systems that can't be unit tested. So, think sort of circa 2000s, monoliths, SOAs, those kinds of things. They tend not to be able to be run very easily locally, or if they are, they require huge amounts of resources or additional licenses from companies to be able to run them. So oftentimes they don't run on your dev machine, they run on a separate environment. And that just means they can't really be tested with Pact, because Pact doesn't want to work that way. It wants to be run in a unit test context. So this could be another option there. And the fourth one is around API gateways and third-party APIs. This can help do a bit more of that than what Pact does. Particularly with API gateways, they're often very pass-through. And with that means your Pact tests get a bit weird, because your consumers have some rich behavior. They send their request to the gateway, which really just passes it through. And so there's a lot of mocking that needs to go on the gateway to make those tests pass. And then they basically need to replicate those same tests for their downstream systems. So bidirectional would remove a lot of that clunkiness. In terms of context, as we said before, when this might be appropriate, when you can't do Pact or those code-based contract tests. So maybe you need to do black box testing, or you've already got those tools in place. That's a context that's useful here. And of course, as I said before, when you can bring your own tools and you've already got a rich investment in those products and tools, you might want to do that to be able to leverage that investment. Okay, so we talked about it briefly before, so I won't go too far, but next steps, go give it a go. The best way to do that is just to head to docs.pactflow.io, and you can use your existing Pactflow account. It's on all plans, free and paid. All of our documentation is available. The workshops are available. These example projects are there. That's a really good starting point to get going. And I'd encourage you all to give it a go and let us know what you thought about it.